Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Morgan Bluma, and I look forward to presenting my thesis to you today. I'll be examining the text Twilight and Jane Eyre and the embedded emotional abuse enacted by the brooding antiheroes. Both texts are incredibly popular. They've both sold millions of copies. They both have movie adaptations, and they are a large part of popular culture today. I'll be using Lauren Bernant's idea of cruel optimism to explore why we return to texts that we know work against us. She explains cruel optimism is when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. So I will be examining how these narratives normalize and fetishize the structure of inequality within heterosexuality. She explains this optimism as cruel because the object, quote, ignites a sense of possibility, actually makes it impossible to obtain the expansive transformation for which a person or a people risk striving, end quote. This basically means an object that is not possible to obtain is presented as possible by striving for a specific transformation the person has to undergo. And so for my thesis, I will be examining the text Twilight and Jane Eyre to show how these narratives make desirable and romanticize abusive behaviors within heterosexual power dynamics. The brooding men within these texts embody the patriarchal society we live in. They dominate, they control, they are dangerous, and they are rich. And the women in these texts are push to domesticity like marriage, submissiveness, and purity. Within Twilight, Bella expresses her desire to not marry, but Edward pushes her towards marriage. And within Jane Eyre, Jane is presented as a strong, educated, independent woman who can only support herself in a marriage with a man who repeatedly lies and tricks her, like proposing Jane be his mistress and also lying about his wife, Bertha, he keeps in the attic. Within Twilight, Edward is the bad and dangerous vampire who controls Bella and who she sees while also continuing to stalk her. He watches her while she is sleeping in the middle of the night without her knowledge and prevents her from visiting her friend Jacob. Within my thesis, I close read examples of the moments when the supernatural elements aid in the transformation of the emotional abuse these women face into romantic gestures and expressions. Within Twilight, Bella sees Edward as a vampire for the first time, and she says, quote, I sat without moving, more frightened of him than I had ever been. I'd never seen him so completely freed of that carefully calculated facade. He'd never been less human or more beautiful. Face ashen, eyes wide, I sat like a bird locked in the eyes of a snake, end quote. Within this moment, she is acknowledging this fear, but she reshapes it in a way that Edward is exposing his true self to her. She sees him as beautiful and not the scary, bloodthirsty vampire he is. His vampirism is what masks the emotional abuse Bella is experiencing at this moment. Within Jane Eyre, we have a similar moment. Jane Eyre makes desirable the ideas of brooding antiheroes and their inability to fully express their romantic emotions. At one moment in the novel, Mr. Rochester schemes to fool Jane into believing he intends to marry Blanche Ingram. He disguises himself as a fortune teller to retrieve the information from Jane to make her jealous. Here, Mr. Rochester uses a supernatural element, like the fortune teller, to disguise the emotional abuse he puts Jane through. Jane acknowledges her disappointment in Mr. Rochester for tricking her, but she also expresses that she did not fall for his trickery and she can forgive him. I explore how supernatural and fantastical elements push their heroines into loving and accepting these brooding antiheroes. While these women seem to reach happiness at the end of these texts, there are certain supernatural elements that need to occur. Within Twilight, Bella is turned into a vampire, changing the power dynamics between Edward and herself. Within Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester is disfigured, and with Bertha's death, Jane agrees to marry Mr. Rochester. Jane also receives a large amount of money in her uncle's will that changes her social class, again, changing power dynamics between the man and the woman. Both of these examples show how these women are participating in the patriarchy. The supernatural elements undercut the violence and danger of the patriarchy. The supernatural also serves as a way to access people's fantasies to discipline them into social norms. This transformation between the men and the woman is how these narratives deal with the contradictory values within the real world, the patriarchy versus domesticity. I argue that these texts are so appealing due to the way they put into words this conflict that is happening, and how these narratives glamorize the brooding men into misunderstood romantic heroes that makes the patriarchy desirable. These narratives offer women examples of how to succeed in the patriarchal society we live in, even though this can only be accomplished through particular conditions. This is where cruel optimism is at play. The text promises us a fantasy of romantic love that is beyond possible because it is centered in the supernatural, but it is also toxic. It is important to look at these texts because domestic abuse and violence is a real issue around the world, and these texts need to be taken seriously. These narratives are crucial to understanding how the patriarchy continues to remain normative in heterosexual power dynamics. Thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to answer your questions.